Hello everyone, it's Jill Leckie here, and I'm going to run you through this presentation talking about protein intake following training or competition. So again, prior to prescribing recovery strategies, or specifically in the context of this presentation, protein intake following exercise, we really need to understand the training and the event demands. So what was the exercise that has actually taken place? So for example, on the top left-hand side, we've got a team pursuit, which lasts, a maximum of 4 minutes. Then on the bottom right, we've got an AFL match, which, can last anywhere up to 2 hours. So we really need to understand the demands of these sessions prior to prescribing the intake following exercise. So understanding both the intensity and duration is absolutely key, so that we can provide the best nutrition possible afterwards. So when we think about protein, most people will say, yep, protein's important for muscle repair, which is absolutely correct, but protein's much more than that, and it's actually essential to life. And this is really reflected in the extensive number of roles that it actually plays. So I've listed a few here down the left-hand side of the screen. So for example, protein is actually involved in muscle contraction. So some of the enzymes that are involved, so actin myosin, are really key for muscle contraction. In addition to that, protein is involved in fuel transport in the muscles. So we know that, so for example, many enzymes are actually proteins. So for example, glycogen phosphorylase is key for the breakdown of glycogen. Then we have cell signaling as well. So for example, when you consume protein, we get this increase in insulin response. Protein is also involved in structure and regulation of cells. So for example, collagen, so makeup of the bones and skin, it's proteins involved in that as well. So because proteins involved in so many functions, we would not consider it a primary fuel source. So unlike carbohydrate and fat sources, which we would consider as a primary fuel source that would be used throughout exercise periods, we really don't want to rely on protein for that because of the host of functions that it's actually required for. So just to give you a bit more information around protein balance throughout the day. So you might hear people talking about, these regular protein spikes throughout the day. And this graph really represents that quite well. So on the left, or on the y-axis, we've got muscle protein balance. And on the x-axis, you can see time throughout the day. So what you can see is that when we ingest a meal or containing protein, we get this increase in muscle protein synthesis, or the building or making of new proteins, which really helps support protein balance throughout the day. So it's really like balancing a seesaw is what we're trying to achieve throughout the day through those regular intakes of protein. What we can see is that with this combination of resistance exercise and ingesting a meal, we get this increased capacity for muscle protein synthesis. So that really helps support the muscle protein balance throughout the day. So when we have simply just a meal, we would get an increase in protein synthesis for around 5 to 6 hours following. Whereas when we complete resistance exercise as well, in addition to the protein intake, we actually get an increase for approximately 24 to 48 hours following that exercise bout. So as I mentioned, and as this presentation is really focusing on recovery from exercise, what I've included here is just a few of the functions that are required for, the protein is required for post-exercise. So starting from the left-hand side, as I've mentioned previously, stimulating muscle protein synthesis. So really helping balance that protein balance throughout the day. In addition to that, you might have athletes that want to actually increase their lean mass, so supporting muscle hypertrophy. So following a resistance training session, we know that we see a lot of athletes straight away ingest that protein to really support that process. In addition to that, protein has a few other functions, including reducing muscle soreness and also repairing muscle damage that may have taken place during that session. And then lastly, as I said, just maintaining that seesaw of the protein balance throughout the day. So these functions, in combination with what I've meant previously, protein really is an extremely important nutrient to ingest throughout the day. It has so many functions within the body. But when it comes to actually prescribing protein to athletes, there's a few things we need to take into consideration for them. Firstly, we have the total. So how much protein should I actually recommend? We also have the timing. So when should I actually recommend protein to athletes? So should they have it before exercise? Should they have it afterwards? Should they have it regularly throughout the day? We also have what type of protein. So should the protein be from a whey protein source, a soy protein source? Should it be from a steak, from salmon? So there's a lot of questions around the total, timing and type, referred to typically as the 3 T's. Okay, so how much protein is enough? So how much should we recommend to athletes following a specific training session or competition? So this is a study by Moore and colleagues where they got a group of males to complete a single acute bout of resistance exercise followed by the ingestion of whole egg protein. So they either ingested 10, 20, 30 or 40 grams of whole egg protein, which is a high quality complete amino acid profile protein. So the results from this study, we can see here as on the x-axis we've got the protein intake and on the y-axis we've got the muscle fractional synthetic rate of protein synthesis. So what we can see is from 0 to 20 grams, so there's an increase in this fractional synthetic rate. However, when we get to 20 grams, there doesn't seem to be a large increase with an increased dose of protein. So it starts to plateau off, which would suggest that providing 20 grams to athletes following exercise would be sufficient. However, we do have to take into consideration body mass rather than providing an absolute dose of protein, which has more recently been followed up in the research. And this has come to a recommendation of a general rule of thumb of providing about 0.3 to 0.4 grams per kilo body mass per meal and post-exercise of protein. So for example, for a 75 kilogram male or female trained individual, this would mean providing 23 to 30 grams of protein per serve. So that's quite easy to achieve, both at meal times and straight after exercise. So this is sort of followed up with a more recent recommendation of individualized nutrition, which is, throughout the whole of the nutrition area, rather than providing an absolute dose to everyone. Okay, so the next question we ask is, when should I have protein, or when should I actually recommend that athletes have protein? So is it before exercise, is it after exercise, or is it potentially during exercise? So this is a study by Jose Areta in 2013, and what they actually did was provide a total of 80 grams of protein following an acute single bout of resistance exercise. So 4 times 8 reps at 80% of 1 rep max. And they provided 80 grams of protein following this bout of exercise. They either provided it in two doses, so 2 40-gram doses, so 40 grams every 6 hours, or they provided 20 grams every 3 hours, or they provided 10 grams every 1.5 hours. So there was 3 different types of protein ingestion, but the total intake was exactly the same. And what we can see represented by the green bar is that the myofibril fractional synthetic rate, or protein synthesis, was much higher with the 20 grams every 3 hours across 12-hour period in comparison to 40 grams every 6 hours or 10 grams every 1.5 hours. So that would really align well with the regular intake throughout the day, which I showed you on the second slide, really showing how this protein intake contributes towards that protein balance. And it also really aligns with what we would typically do with ingestion of meals throughout the day as well. So another area that has become particularly interesting for a variety of reasons, both for the elderly population and athletic population, is this pre-sleep protein. So if we think about the period of sleep, there's really 8 hours in the day where we're not fueling the body at all when we take into consideration, every other hour of the day. So researchers have been looking at ingesting protein prior to sleep and how this would actually impact protein synthesis during sleep as well. So in this study, participants completed a single bout of resistance exercise, and they then consumed a recovery drink straight afterwards, which was either a casein protein or a placebo. And this was 30 minutes prior to sleep. And what we can see from the results is that there was an increase in muscle protein synthesis, represented by the green bar, when 40 grams of protein was consumed prior to sleep. So this suggests that the protein was effectively digested and absorbed, and that it would actually, if completed consistently across time, would improve overnight protein balance. So perhaps this is a recommendation that could be suggested to athletes, especially if they're completing training late in the evening. So based on this information, again, the general rule of thumb based on the current literature is that 1 serve of protein, so that 0.3 to 0.4 grams per kilogram of body mass that I mentioned in the previous slide, every 3 to 4 hours. And in addition to that, immediately post-exercise. And depending on the time of day of exercise, you might consider that 30 to 40 grams pre-sleep as well to really improve that protein balance throughout the night. And I would say that's really important for consideration for athletes that potentially have to back up the next day. So if they're racing consistently over several days, then that might become extremely important. Okay, so the next question you might ask is, what type of protein should I actually have, or should I actually provide to athletes? So you'll notice that the majority of the research has explored either whey protein or casein protein in the form of a shake, because it's obviously very easy to provide. But what we need to take into consideration is that, can we actually optimize nutrition through providing whole food to athletes as well, and also the fact that they will typically have a meal soon after exercise as well, and how does that impact their recovery or their muscle protein synthesis following a period of exercise. So we know that milk contains 2 protein fractions, so both whey and casein, and this is actually characterized by their digestion rate. So here I've identified that whey and soy protein are rapidly digesting, whereas the casein protein is actually a slower digesting protein. And that's highlighted in the slide previously, which was why it was provided prior to sleep, because it takes much longer to digest, and it has that time throughout the evening when we're asleep. So in addition to this, more recently, research has investigated the impact of whole food on muscle protein synthesis. So in this research study, 12 healthy males actually completed an acute bout of resistance exercise, followed by the ingestion of either milk or beef following the training. And what we can see here is that there was an increase in the muscle protein synthetic rate following the ingestion of both milk and beef. But this was much higher in the milk during the 2 hours post-exercise. However, from 2 to 5 hours, there was actually no difference. So we can actually provide a variety of proteins during the recovery period, and typically the question we really have to think about is what's actually practical. So a lot of the time, athletes will consume protein shakes immediately post-exercise, and this is really because it's very practical. So they can have it in their kit bag, or they can have it down at the gym, or they can have it potentially out in the field where they're training. So we really have to think about what is actually practical for athletes. So I guess just a couple of take-home messages from this presentation. So Based on the current literature, I would say the total recommendation for protein intake regularly throughout the day and post-exercise to really optimize that recovery is going to be 0.3 to 0.4 grams per kilogram body mass per meal and post-exercise. And the timing of this, well, we know that one serve of protein should be consumed every 3 to 4 hours, so in every single meal, and immediately post-exercise. And when we say immediately, a lot of this, this takes into consideration convenience as well, because typically if an athlete doesn't have the protein shake immediately post-exercise, they can get distracted by completing a cool down, or they'll have to drive 30 minutes home, then they'll take a shower, and then they often forget to actually initiate that recovery process. And in addition to that, times when trainings may be completed in the evening or when athletes have to back up across a period of time, then the 30 to 40 grams of protein pre-sleep should be considered as well. And lastly, what type of protein should they have? And I would really end this by saying consider what's actually practical for your athletes. So if that's a protein shake straight away on the field, followed by when they get when they get home, then they would follow it up by whole food sources as well. I've included a whole host of references which you can look at as well from this presentation. So thank you.